You are listening to a Time Siren production.
Two things were abundantly clear. Something had pushed the TARDIS seriously off course, and the decade-old machinery inside the laundromat wouldn't protect the Doctor from the Daleks' laser bolts for much longer.
You are the Doctor, you are an enemy of the Daleks,
screeched the white and gold menace as it launched another blast at the back of the washing machine, which vibrated violently against the Doctor's back. Yes, yes, sighed the Doctor, and then you will take over the world and have unlimited rice pudding.
Daleks do not desire pudding. We only desire the total extermination of all lesser beings.
Oh, you lot just don't understand jokes, the Doctor said, stalling for time as he pulled out his sonic screwdriver. But how about a little slapstick? Surely that'll get a laugh.
Daleks do not laugh.
No, but I do. And with that, the Doctor pulled down the switch on his sonic screwdriver. A high-pitched buzzing was heard as all the washing machines around him suddenly began spinning at high speed.
What is happening?
Cried the Dalek, its eye stalk spinning around and taking in the sudden commotion. The Doctor used the momentary distraction to dart across the room, dive over the counter, and through the door into the back office. The Dalek clearly heard the door slamming shut, as its gunstick suddenly took aim. But before it could fire, the door of each and every washing machine burst open, and the room filled with suds and bubbles. And with that, the Dalek fired its gun. Suddenly the mound of foam glowed red as the energy from the laser bolt was conducted through the massive bubbles. The Dalek screamed, as the energy found its way back inside the metal machine and into the mutant inside. Gotcha, smiled the Doctor as he watched the scene unfold through the small window in the door. The screams of the Dalek suddenly stopped, and the red glow faded away. The creature inside the machine was dead. The Doctor breathed a sigh of relief. Any day he faced off against a Dalek and lived was a lucky day. But enough self-reflection, he thought. Now to figure out where exactly he was and what had drawn the TARDIS here. He looked around the room he'd now found himself in. It was a laundromat's office. Nothing too exciting, though the lack of computer and general decor indicated that he was in the 20th century. 60s probably, judging by the carpet, and most likely Britain. He spotted a newspaper on the desk and picked it up. He barely looked at the headlines before he caught the date. The 29th of November, 1963. Oh no, he thought. It can't be. He frantically went back to the desk to look for something, anything that would tell him where he was. He spotted a leaflet for the laundromat. Picking it up and scanning it for the address, it was as he'd feared. He was in Shoreditch, London. Judging by the time on the clock, it was early morning, probably before the business had even opened. The newspaper was probably left overnight, making it the 30th of November, 1963. Omega Day. He couldn't be here. He couldn't risk running into the wrong person and altering the history of one of the most important events of his life. The day he destroyed the Dalek homeworld of Skaro. Even killing that one Dalek could have ripple effects that could unravel his entire timeline. The best course of action was to head back to the TARDIS, which had landed a few streets away. The Doctor darted out the back door of the laundromat and into the alleyway. It would just take him a few minutes to run back to the ship. Or it would have if he hadn't tripped over a very anachronistic backpack that had been carelessly dropped on the cobblestone floor. The mystery of where the backpack had come from was one that would still elude the Doctor in their next incarnation.
The bottomless waterfall of SR7 was a mystery the Doctor had been meaning to explore since she was a curly-haired man in a patchwork coat. This newest incarnation may have had a similar taste for bright colours in her clothes, albeit in a better composition. But one thing was for certain, she had by far the best taste in music of all her incarnations so far. Currently, the final notes of Safety Dance were fading out as the needle ran the groves of Men Without Hats' second album, Rhythm of Youth. The Doctor paused for a moment in the brief second of silence, trying to remember what song was next. The album answered for her as the unmistakably bouncy opening of Ideas for All suddenly filled the wardrobe the Doctor was currently inside. Having determined the song to be a suitable accompaniment to her search, she continued rummaging. Many friends, companions, and even enemies had asked how big the TARDIS was, or at least how big the inside was. It was a question she was never 100% sure how to answer, though her favourite one she's come up with was, well, how big's big? Sarah had rightly pointed out that that wasn't an answer, but that hadn't stopped the Doctor using it time and time again. Now, she wasn't currently asking herself how big the TARDIS was, she was in fact asking herself how a space so big could be so completely devoid of a usable backpack. She had everything she needed for her trip to SR7. Doubles of what she needed in most cases. She found plenty of climbing equipment, snacks, water bottles, and even an old mixtape where she had rechristened her rock climbing music. Yet still no backpack. She was about to give up hope when she caught something at the corner of her eye, a section dedicated to her immediate predecessor's wardrobe. She had no idea what she saw in those ridiculous duffel coats, and a memory popped into her head. She pulled out a couple of duffel coats and half a dozen sweater vests, and there, underneath, was a backpack. She picked it up and examined it. It looked just as new as the day she found it in that alley in Shoreditch. She never found out what it was doing in 1963. It clearly wasn't naive, judging by the brightly coloured images of the characters from Bluey, a late 2010s animated series all over it. Well, that's a mystery for another time, she thought. Right now, she was excited to finally check out this bottomless waterfall, and the backpack would be just the right size for all her gear, with a little adjustment to its inner dimensions, of course. It wasn't too long after that the TARDIS landed. The Doctor flicked a few last switches on the central console and then grabbed her backpack. She looked around the console room. She was so fond of the wooden brass interior, but it just didn't feel like her anymore. The one thing no one ever warned her about regeneration, having to redecorate after each one. Usually the TARDIS would take care of it. As she headed for the door, she made mental notes of where she would move some stuff. That fancy armchair could go to the reading room, as would all the books, and she would replace the vintage record player with the slightly less vintage 80s one she'd be using up in the wardrobe. The records would stay though. Yes, that would be lovely. She stepped through the TARDIS doors, expecting to find herself in the lush purple forests of SR7. Instead, she found herself in a cave. Right, interesting, she muttered to herself. This hadn't been what the TARDIS scanner had shown her. That should have been enough to make her go back inside and see what was up with her ship. But she'd found herself to be more of a throwing caution to the wind type of Doctor in this newest incarnation. So she decided to press on. After all, this could well be a cave on SR7. It wasn't a cave on SR7. Everything was wrong. The colour of the moss, the shape of the rocks, even the smell of the water and the occasional puddle she stepped into. Still, she pressed on, as she could see light up ahead. Daylight. but as she got closer, she saw the light was slightly red. "Oh, come on, don't do this to me," she said, though she already knew what planet she'd landed on. It was Gallifrey. She briefly cheered for small mercies as she noted she wasn't in the capital or Arcadia or any of the planet's other cities, though the grassy and wet terrain before her seemed oddly familiar. And then it happened. In a flash, the sky turned from its natural deep red to a light blue, a perception filter designed to trick the combatants into thinking they were still in their home world. That's when the Doctor knew this was the Death Zone. And not just that, but the exact spot where she and Sarah had encountered the Raston warrior robot. Before she could run back to the TARDIS, she heard the distinct sound of the robot, the most perfect killing machine ever devised, landing just a few meters away. All she had time to do was move behind a large rock and hope she could figure a way out of this. This wasn't just the same spot she had encountered the robot previously, this was the same robot. She summarised she'd landed here a few days before her past self, or selves as it were. Not that this info did much to help her current situation. The robot hunted by detecting movement and could move like lightning. They had built-in weapons and could fire discs and arrows from their hands. If it wasn't for the fact that they enjoyed toying with their prey, the Doctor knew she'd be dead already. That said, it was only a matter of time before it got bored and decided to finish her off. She needed a plan. If she could distract it somehow, maybe she could run for it, get back to the TARDIS before she found a spear through her hearts. Then she remembered the backpack. Shrugging it off her shoulders, she prepared to throw it. Hopefully, while the robot inspected it, she would dart the other way. This was a very stupid plan. Fortunately, that was her speciality. She threw the backpack. As soon as it broke free from the cover of the rock, a silver javelin struck it, pinning it to the ground a few feet away. Her plan hadn't worked. The robot slowly walked around the rock and turned towards her. It didn't have a face, but she knew it was looking directly at her. It raised an arm, ready to fire one of its projectiles. The Doctor closed her eyes. And then suddenly, she heard the zap and opened her eyes just in time to see a small section of rock between the robot's feet explode. There was the unmistakable smell of a laser rifle that had just been fired. The robot turned to face the newcomers. The Doctor crept around the giant rock that had been giving her cover and caught sight of the new players. 3 Sontaran soldiers. One of the Sontarans, the one holding the smoking laser rifle, lifted his helmet.
By virtue of my authority as an officer of the Army Space Corps, I hereby order you to tell us why you have brought us here, alien,
spoke the Sontaran. The robot cocked its head, but otherwise didn't move.
I am General Scar of the 17th Sontaran Battle Fleet, Scar the Kingslayer. You will answer me,
said the Sontaran, already beginning to lose his cool.
Sir,
chimed in one of his men.
Scans indicate this is a non-organic life form, a robot. No wonder it's so stupid. Very well, take care of...
Before Scar could finish his sentence, the Raston warrior robot threw a metal disc at the Sontaran with the scanner. The disc cut straight through his helmet and sliced into the flesh beneath. The Doctor watched as the soldier collapsed to the floor, green blood spilling out of the broken helmet. Within moments, the other soldier fell with a metal javelin through his chest. Scar wailed as he raised his rifle and fired, but the robot was too quick and had already vanished, appearing behind the general. But Scar was an old soldier and wouldn't fall as easily as his men. He managed to dodge the metal discs that had been thrown at his chest.
Yes, it has been so long since I faced a worthy opponent,
Scar said with glee.
Sontar! Sontar!
The Doctor didn't stay to see how the fight would end. She ran back into the cave and towards the TARDIS. She could hear the sounds of the fight behind her, laser rifle blasts, the robot using its lightning speed. She heard Scar cry out the Kingslayer had fallen. Would the Raston warrior robot follow her into the cave now? All she had to do was reach the TARDIS and she'd be safe.
The Doctor often found themselves running. Through caves, down corridors, towards something. Though more often than not, it was away from something. Monsters mostly. The cave he was currently running down was ice, and the monstrous menace chasing him was a still silver nightmare. It was a monster the Doctor considered to be one of his most dangerous foes, a Cyberman. No matter how long he lived, no matter how far he went, they always showed up eventually. This wasn't how his day had been supposed to go. After a hair-raising few weeks, where it seemed that whenever he landed there was trouble. Not big trouble. Well, mostly it hadn't been big trouble. There was the Quark occupation of Red Rocket Rising. That had been quite the ordeal. But for the most part, it had been smaller trouble. Things like his return to Cranley Manor, reuniting with Robin Hood, and his second time on the set of a Keystone's Cop movie. It had all been very busy. A relaxing day on the beach had been long overdue. With his old Panama hat on, he'd exited the TARDUS expecting to be on the lush beaches of Fiesta 95, or Yegros Alpha. He'd instead found himself in a place he'd not thought about in a long time. Zebra Bay, an Arctic drilling base owned by the GSO organisation. He'd been here once before, thousands of years ago from the perspective of his own personal timeline, though it had only been a few months on Earth. Turned out the survey team had unearthed a crashed cybership, and soon the base had been overrun with cybermats. Cybermats that were spreading a virus that turned flesh to metal, transforming most of the survey team into a crude sort of cyberdrone. When he'd left with Amy, his travelling companion at the time, he suggested the survivors contact UNIT to clean up the mess, and they had, locking what they had thought were dead Cybermen into storage. And didn't that bite them in the derriere later? But that wouldn't happen for a few years yet. He'd only had time to return his hat to the TARDIS and grab his long grey coat before he encountered Unit Captain Summer PEAR. Her and her team had picked up a signal coming from inside the base and had come in to investigate. By the time the Doctor arrived, Summer was the only one left.
One Cyberman,
she said to the Doctor through gritted teeth, while also holding back her tears.
Just one, and now my team is dead.
The Cyberman had captured her team, one at a time, and dragged them down to the crashed cybership. Summer and the Doctor had eventually made their way down there and found them, or what was left of them. The machines on the ship had attempted to convert the soldiers into Cybermen, but the equipment was old and malfunctioning. In many ways, that was a mercy, though the Doctor didn't say this out loud to Summer. "We'll get it," he promised her. And so, they had formed a plan. It was a fairly terrible plan that went wrong at the crucial moment. The Doctor was to lure the Cyberman out into the open. This was a fairly simple task, and the part of the plan that had gone smoothly, though the Doctor hadn't quite been prepared for the creature that walked out of the shadows. He'd expected a regular Cyberman, and it mostly resembled one. Its grey head had the characteristic handlebars, though one was bent out of shape. The torso was mostly intact, though it had cracks in the armour through which the Doctor could make out parts of the human inside. Its limbs, though, what should have been steel armour, was instead a twisted amalgamation of bone, wire and muscle. The Doctor couldn't tell if it had been damaged or if its conversion had gone horribly wrong. Either way, it was Summer's job to take the cyborg out with a rifle and several gold-tipped bullets. At least, that was the plan. Once the Cyberman had appeared, the Doctor waited for Summer to take the shot. The shot that didn't come. The Doctor had just a couple seconds to contemplate what could have happened to her, and the Cyberman suddenly raced towards him. It seemed that without most of its armour to weigh it down, it could move much faster than a regular Cyberman. How long could he keep running? He would eventually weaken, his energy would be gone, but the Cyberman was relentless, as most typical Cybermen were. He thought of many times they'd encountered them before. The tombs, the London sewers, Nerva, and the freighter. The last thought stung. Magic. The Doctor almost paused, but the clanging of the Cyberman racing towards him shot back to the forefront of his mind, and he continued to run at full speed. His next thought was now, where the hell is Summer? Then suddenly, as if she had heard the doctor's thoughts, Summer jumped out of a corridor in front of him.
Duck!
She yelled, and the doctor didn't need to be told twice. He'd hit the floor just in time for several blue laser bolts to fly over his head, striking the Cyberman, which fell to the ground with a satisfying clunk. Summer stepped over the doctor towards the fallen creature, which was still twitching on the ground. Getting to his feet, the doctor followed Summer. He watched as she silently lifted a large silver ray gun and fired at the fallen Cyberman. It stopped moving once and for all. He was about to ask where she'd found the gun, when he noticed that it wasn't a gun at all, but the arm of a Cyberman. She'd found a way to fire its wrist-mounted laser. She dropped the arm onto the ground. Deep, red liquid began to pool beneath it. The doctor didn't want to ask if it was blood or oil. Summer explained that one of her men's conversion had been partially successful, and he'd attacked her before she could shoot the other. Eventually, she'd overpowered him and was able to rip off his arm to use as a makeshift weapon. They searched the rest of the cyber ship, the doctor using his sonic screwdriver to scan and ultimately conclude that there were no more living Cybermen on board. They eventually found a room where the Cyberman had evidently been constructing some kind of communication device, probably to call the rest of the cyber fleet. It wasn't finished, so no danger of that. But the doctor noticed one component, a small grey cuboid object. He unplugged it from the machine and held it in his hand. It was eerily familiar.
The doctor placed the small cuboid device on his work desk. He'd run every sort of test he could think of using every piece of equipment he had in the TARDIS's vast laboratory, and he discovered nothing. Just about the only thing he hadn't tried was plugging it directly into the TARDIS herself, but that seemed like a very unwise course of action. He sighed and fell back into his old wooden and surprisingly comfortable office chair. It had been strange enough finding a backpack discarded in an alleyway in 1963, a backpack covered in pictures of a cartoon character that wouldn't exist until 2018, but then finding an electronic device inside the backpack which was at least a few centuries more advanced than anything in 2018, let alone 1963. That was the strange Terry on top of a very strange cake. He'd spent all day on this, or at least whatever passed for a day inside the TARDIS. He considered himself a fairly good scientist, and spending an entire day on this and having nothing to show for it was more than a little frustrating. The doctor yawned. It was no good. He wasn't going to figure it out today. He might as well retire for the evening. He opened one of the drawers on his work desk and pulled out a bottle of rum and a glass tumbler. Even if he hadn't come up with any answers, he'd earned himself a drink. Pouring himself a glass, he thought about how he might spend the evening. A little reading, perhaps? Or he could watch a film. Maybe Roger Rabbit. That one had always helped to cheer him up after his more frustrating days. The doctor chuckled to himself as he drank his rum and remembered some of his favourite scenes from the movie. Wait a minute, he thought to himself. That was it! There was a scene in the film where the private investigator, Eddie Valiant, discovered the whereabouts of murdered jokester Marvin Acme's missing will. Valiant had accidentally left a glass on a photo of Acme after a few too many drinks, only for the bottom of the glass to act as a magnifying glass and reveal that the will had been in the man's pocket all along. He looked down at the cuboid device. Surely he couldn't have missed something so simple. Retrieving a magnifying glass from a chipped mug and pencil pot on his desk, and began to study the various rough metal surfaces of the device. And there it was, written in old High Gallifreyan, 2 simple words carved into the side. Hello, sweetie. It couldn't be her, could it? He hadn't seen River in years, and truth be told, he'd suspected that their adventures together had come to an end. But the trouble with time travellers was that you always met each other in the wrong order. So it was quite impossible to predict when you might run into one another. Could this device really have been left there by River? It would certainly fit her eccentric and often infuriating style of contacting him. The Doctor poured himself another rum and thought about what to do next. If it hadn't been left by River, then it could be some sort of trap. But on the other hand, if it had been left by her, there was a good chance he was currently in a life or death situation and relying on him to come and save her. The Doctor finished his rum and looked over at a small picture frame that sat comfortably between the chipped mug that had become a pencil pot and a Lego police box Susan had given him on their first Christmas on Earth. The frame was psychic and would morph the picture inside to whoever you were thinking about. The Doctor watched as Susan morphed into Bill, who turned into Adric, then Grace, then Leo, and finally settling on River, her smiling face framed by her big curly blonde hair. He had no choice then. If there was even the slightest chance this device was from River, he'd have to use it and see where it led him. It might be a trap, but he hoped it wasn't. It was a trap. Less than 5 seconds after plugging the device into the TARDIS console, the cloister bell began to ring. The monitor on the console came to life, a dance of interlocking circles and hexagons and lines. The device was attempting to hack into the TARDIS system and set its own coordinates. In a flash, the Doctor's hands were on the device as he attempted to rip it from the console. It didn't want to move, but he could feel it getting hotter and hotter under his hand until he physically couldn't hold on to it anymore. The skin on his right hand had turned red, but the pain wasn't enough to draw his attention away from the device itself beginning to glow red with heat before cracking open like an egg, a small explosion inside ripping it apart. He hoped that perhaps the ordeal was over, but one glance towards the monitor showed him that whatever program or virus had been within the device, it was still present inside the TARDIS. By the loons! The Doctor cursed to himself as he attempted to combat the virus, only to find every button and switch on the console was completely dead. No, 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 no! The Doctor called out as he opened up one section of the console and attempted to, for lack of a better phrase, to hotwire his ship. Nothing. Oh, you've made a right dog's ear out of this one, Doctor. Wait a minute. That was it. Dog! And with that thought, the Doctor ran out of the console room and back towards the laboratory. He had a plan. It was a long shot, but it could work. There wasn't just one laboratory on board the TARDIS. There was one for every conceivable school of science. Chemistry, quantum physics, etymology. But the one he needed was robotics. Bursting through the door, the Doctor almost tripped over a robot he'd carelessly left on the floor. Finishing that was the top of his to-do list once the current crisis had been taken care of. He scanned the various half-constructed robots around the room before his eyes landed on one in the back corner. K9, Mark C3. He kneeled down beside the robotic dog, who was missing much of his outer casing and some of his internal wiring too. Fortunately, it wasn't the dog's body he needed, and it just took a couple zaps from his sonic screwdriver to remove the head. Tucking it under his arm, he began to journey back to the console room. He exited the lab and flew down the corridor. Then he froze, as standing right ahead of him, blocking his way, was the robot he'd almost tripped over moments ago. It looked at him as strange lights danced across its body. The Doctor had been working on this machine for some time. In many ways, he was based on an old friend, specifically in some of the functions of his body. But that was all he'd completed. He hadn't programmed in a mind yet. It shouldn't be able to sit up, let alone stand and move. Then he remembered. It had still been connected to the computer in the lab, a computer still linked up to the larger TARDIS systems. The virus was in the robot. "Perhaps we can negotiate?" said the Doctor, attempting his most charming smile. The lights on the robot's body began to coalesce, creating a holographic image that encased the metal man until what was standing before the Doctor didn't resemble a robot at all, but an Ogron. The Doctor couldn't think of a worse person to try and negotiate with. So he ran in the opposite direction. He could hear it chasing him, moving much faster than a real Ogron. He needed to find a place to hide, and eventually settled on the TARDIS's boot cupboard. The robot was almost on top of him as he slammed shut the door. He could feel it trying to force its way in, and in his scramble to pull out the sonic screwdriver, he dropped K9's head with a clatter. But he got the screwdriver and was able to successfully seal the door.
Master?
K9! Oh, I'm so sorry. That fall must have activated you.
My motor functions do not seem to be functioning.
Yeah, again, sorry. I needed to get you to the console room fast, so I removed your head, the doctor answered as he retrieved his companion from the floor. I'm sure you understand.
This will make playing fetch rather difficult, Master.
Was that a joke, K9?
Affirmative, Master.
How about that? I'm proud of you. Who's a good boy? A sudden bang against the door brought the doctor back to the current situation. He pocketed the sonic screwdriver, gave K9 a quick scratch behind the ears.
What is happening, Master?
A virus has begun to take over the TARDIS. I was planning on doing a very clever thing by having you take on the role of an antivirus. You are, after all, one of the most advanced robotic brains in the universe. The doctor sighed. But that's all for naught if we can't get to the console room.
What about the secondary console room, Master?
The doctor held his robotic companion's head up and grinned at his metallic dog face. Oh, you wonderful dog! Why didn't I think of that? K9 wiggled his ears in response. Now let's go save the TARDIS. And with that, the doctor ran off with K9's head in tow, out the door on the other side of the boot cupboard, leaving the robot disguised as an Ogron pounding at the one they'd originally came in. The second console room, which, now come to think of it, might have been the original control room, unless he was actually run towards the tertiary control room, was deep enough inside the TARDIS that hopefully the virus hadn't reached it yet. He'd lost track some time ago exactly where it was, and he wasn't sure what it currently looked like. An occupational hazard due to the habit of redecorating after almost every regeneration. Luckily, K9's sense of direction was far better than that of the doctor's, and they soon arrived at the secondary, or possibly tertiary console room. They entered the yellow and beige room and headed directly to the console. Instead of the floor, like most of the control rooms, the control console was attached to the ceiling by the time rotor, giving it the appearance of some sort of giant, upside-down, metal and glass mushroom. The doctor gently placed K9's head upon the console. He then opened up one of the 6 segments that made up the controls, disconnecting a few wires and plugged them into K9. Okay boy, are you ready for this? He asked, giving his dog a pat on the head.
Affirmative, Master.
Thank you, old friend. And with that, the doctor pulled down a large lever on the TARDIS console. The light behind K9's eyes dimmed and then went out, as did the lights in the control room. K9? Silence. Oh, please tell me this worked. The doctor was about to attempt a reboot of the TARDIS systems when the door to the room suddenly burst open. The Ogron robot had finally caught up to him. Why am I always the chef to my own misfortune? The doctor mused to himself. The Ogron's face attempted a smile, but didn't quite manage it. Then the lights began to flicker across its body again, as it shifted between various species, many of which the Doctor had fought on his travels. A Sycorax, a Sea Devil, and a Robo-Man, to name a few. Eventually, it settled on a distinctiveness the Doctor knew all too well. His oldest and best enemy, the Time Lord who liked to be known as the Master. The Doctor regarded the robot, who in its new guise had managed to smile through its bearded face. The Master was the last person in the universe the Doctor wanted to face, though he counted himself fortunate that this was an earlier incarnation, and not the one that had caused so much grief to him in recent times. I hope you're not trying to impress me, he said, hoping the robot couldn't sense the trepidation in his voice. The only reply the robot gave was a slow walk towards the Doctor, and for once the Time Lord didn't know what to do. And then the lights came back on. Attaboy, K9. The robot hadn't stopped its slow walk towards the Doctor. Ah, right. You're not connected to the ship's systems anymore, are you? The machine was almost on top of him. The Doctor's back was pressed against the console.
Excuse me, Master.
K9's voice suddenly rang out. The Doctor ducked, just in time as a bright red laser shot out of K9's nose and struck down the robot, which fell to the floor with an almighty clang. The Doctor waved his sonic screwdriver over the fallen machine, which had reverted back to its original robotic appearance, confirming that it was stone cold dead, all its circuits burnt out. "Thank you, old friend," the Doctor said, getting to his feet and looking over at K9's head. The circuitry within the robot dog had also burnt out. "Oh, K9, mused the Doctor.
Do not worry, Master.
This time, K9's voice echoed from the TARDIS itself.
I have finished uploading my consciousness into the TARDIS systems. There is still much to do to defeat the virus. I must devote 100% of my attention to this task."
The Doctor smiled. "Well, if anyone can do it, it's you, old friend."
Goodbye for now, Master.
K9's voice faded away, and the Doctor stood alone. Perhaps it was time to put up his feet and watch a movie after all.
The Doctor placed the record on the gramophone. Not the one in the TARDIS wardrobe this time, the one in the console room. She had a lot of gramophones and other music-playing machines dotted around the TARDIS. Songs from The Big Chair, the second studio album by Tears for Fears. When had she bought this? No, she hadn't bought it. It had been a gift. From Yaz, maybe. Or Grace, actually. Actually, no, Grace was much more into classical music, so it must have been Yaz. She smiled as she thought of the two women, thinking to herself, "It's better to have loved than lost." But she stopped herself mid-thought. This wasn't the time to be nostalgic. She had a mystery to solve. She dropped the needle onto the record right in the middle of a shout. The new wave synth-pop sounds swarmed around the console room. She already felt a little better. It was time to figure this thing out. "Now, what's this all about?" she asked the TARDIS, stepping up to the console. "You're no stranger taking me to the wrong places, but the last 24 hours have been pushing it a bit. The death zone, right before 4 of my other cells were due to arrive. Unit HQ, well, the field where it was about to be dropped back after returning from the antimatter universe. And that last trip, now that really took the biscuit. The National Gallery, right as the Zygons were breaking out those paintings. I had to hide under a sheet and pretend I was a statue. Do you know how slow Zygons can be? I was standing there for 2 hours." The TARDIS hummed. "Yes, I am aware you also had to hide under a sheet, but standing still for a ridiculous amount of time is a bit easier for you than it is for me." The Doctor sighed. "What is this obsession with visiting my previous multi-me incidents?" She didn't get an answer, just more of the usual hums that emanated from within the ship. The Doctor sighed and fell into the nice armchair she kept in one corner of the room. "I swear, if there's an androgram with a meat cleaver waiting for me the next time I open those doors, we're getting a divorce."
"Mistress?"
came a reply. The Doctor perked up. Did the TARDIS just reply to her? In English? Surely if her ship was going to speak it would be in Gallifreyan.
"Danger, Mistress."
Wait, she knew that voice. K9?
"There is danger, Mistress."
Of course, K9 Mark C3. You're still operating as the TARDIS antivirus. How are you?
"My sensors indicate it is now extreme."
With that, the Doctor jumped to her feet and ran over to the console. "I know better than to ignore your instincts, old friend. I presume this is related to my recent troubles with the TARDIS?"
"Affirmative, Mistress. The virus is determined to take you to previous incidents of your past selves meeting."
"Virus?" The Doctor paused. "Wait, do you mean the same virus we faced when I first uploaded you as the antivirus?"
"Affirmative."
"I thought you defeated that thing ages ago. You're telling me you've been fighting it all this time?"
"I prefer to think of it as a battle in time, Mistress."
"It's been centuries."
"It has been a very long battle."
As much as she was loving this version of K9's sense of humour, they needed to stay focused. "Okay, K9, you're gonna have to tell me what's going on."
"I have managed to keep the virus at bay until now, Mistress. It suddenly overpowered me and was able to influence where the TARDIS would go."
Right, well, let us see if I can give you a boost. And before the Doctor had finished her sentence, she was typing away at one of the 6 segments that made up the TARDIS console. "Okay, so tell me, how many systems has the virus infected?"
"Only the destination systems, Mistress. I have been able to force the virus to remain a single entity, It can only affect one system at a time.
Well, that's helpful. That's really helpful. I'm not quite sure how it will help us, but it means we're safe from affecting the whole TARDIS like last time.
Affirmative, mistress.
But how can we use that? As the Doctor asked this question, the gramophone moved onto a new song, Everybody Wants to Rule the World. This had always been one of her favourite songs, a new wave and synth-pop masterpiece. In 1986, it even won Best Single at the Brit Awards. Wait, a single? That's how they could take care of the virus. K9, if I am very clever, then after a few more keystrokes you'll have a nice boost of power. She finished typing.
Affirmative, mistress. My capabilities are much improved with new, undetectable antivirus facilities.
Excellent. She reached into her pocket and retrieved a cassette tape. Do you think you could force the virus onto here?
Affirmative, mistress.
She could hear the elevation in her dog's voice. Okay then, let's rock and roll. The Doctor inserted the tape into the cassette slot on the console. She really did have various music playing devices all over the place. Then she stood back and watched as the tape began to move, spinning forward as if the tape was fast forwarding. And then it stopped. The tape popped out and the Doctor caught it. Did it work? She asked. A moment's silence. K9?
Yes, mistress. The virus is now safely stored on your Hounds of Love audio cassette.
My what? The Doctor looked at the tape. Damn, this is a great album. It's Running Up That Hill on it, and I love that song. Guess I'll have to get a new copy. The Doctor sighed, but it quickly turned into a laugh. This virus had been attacking her TARDIS for hundreds of years, and now it was trapped on a Kate Bush cassette. She wasn't sure why that was funny, but it was, and she knew exactly what to do with this tape now. It was a short trip for the TARDIS, just a couple of galaxies over. The Doctor was now standing at the doors, looking out at the Decalogue Diamond, one of the most beautiful stars the Doctor had ever encountered. Now she was just waiting for the curious to start on her current song choice. The next move might be a bit over the top, but you can't be too careful in this universe. The chorus came on, and she sang along. I'm walking on sunshine, whoa, don't it feel good? And with that, she dropped the cassette and watched as it got caught in the star's gravity. As she watched it get sucked into the fires below, she reflected on how, as this wasn't the sun, but a completely different star, then her song choice didn't really make sense. Then again, she never did let something as silly as facts get in the way of a good tune.
The burning fires of the Decalogue Diamond were beautiful, but the Doctor wasn't paying attention to them. He was sitting at the TARDIS door, right on the edge, with his legs swaying in space, his eyes fixed on the Cyberman's gizmo. It was identical to the one he'd found in 1963 London, in an anachronistic backpack, just one of the many unsolved mysteries he collected over his last few lives. It wasn't exactly the same. It couldn't be. The device he'd found in 1963 was far more advanced than what the Cybermen he'd encountered at Zebra Bay were capable of, especially one in such disrepair as the one he'd faced yesterday. The Doctor slipped the device back into his pocket and looked down at the Decalogue Diamond. He was finally beginning to relax when he heard the unmistakable sound of a teleporter behind him. Looking over his shoulder, he saw what it was that had intruded on his TARDIS. A KERBLAM man.
Delivery for the Doctor,
the robot said, its permanent smile unmoving. The Doctor eyed the red and white parcel being held out towards him. I didn't order anything, he finally replied. The robot looked at him before repeating,
Delivery for the Doctor.
The Doctor realised that the mechanical man wasn't going to take no for an answer. He sighed, climbed to his feet, and took the box from the delivery bot.
Delivery fulfilled. And remember, if you want it, KERBLAM it.
Yeah, sure, thanks, mumbled the Doctor, absent-mindedly. He held up the box, trying to see if he could work out what it was by its weight. or the sound it made when he shook it. All he figured out was it was somewhat heavy. Perhaps he'd ordered something. The trouble with living in a time machine is that sometimes he'd get deliveries years before he'd ordered it, or maybe a younger him had ordered it yesterday. But that could have been a millennia ago from the perspective of his personal timeline. Ah well, nothing ventured, nothing gained, he eventually said and opened the box. It was a podcast mic. Had he ordered this? He seemed to recall a brief moment in a past life where he'd thought about recording one. Yes, that rang a bell. He'd been inspired to start his own podcast after saving the world by including a certain Venusian lullaby on an episode of Rani Takes on the World and the Blue Box Files. He smiled at the memory, though could have sworn that he'd already received his mic around the time he ordered it. The Doctor's remembrance was interrupted when he noticed that the KERBLAM man was still standing in his TARDIS. Usually, they would teleport away as soon as the delivery was complete. "Do you want a tip or something?" the Doctor asked drolly.
Delivery for the Doctor.
Heard that one before. Are you stuck on repeat?
Delivery for the Doctor.
Oh, the Doctor pulled out his sonic screwdriver and gave the KERBLAM man a quick scan. Nothing obviously wrong with you.
Delivery for the Doctor.
Alright, fine. What are you delivering?
The Doctor's death.
Suddenly, the robot's eyes turned red, and it lunged at the Doctor, who jumped to the side at the last moment. The KERBLAM man landed where the Doctor had been with a loud clunk. But within a few seconds, it sprung back to his feet. The Doctor had already run around the other side of the room, putting the TARDIS control console between himself and the machine. The Doctor quickly pressed a few buttons, activating various scanners, hoping one would give him a clue as to what was wrong with the delivery droid. But before he could get any answers, the KERBLAM man was on him, having moved with speed and agility the Doctor wouldn't have thought possible. The robot quickly overpowered the Doctor, pushing him to the floor. It then raised its booted foot, and the Doctor didn't fancy sticking around long enough to find out what it was planning next. Rolling out of the way, the Doctor scrambled to his feet. He glanced at the monitor on the console, but it hadn't yet finished its scans. He needed to buy himself some time. The robot was almost on top of him again. He needed to think of something fast. A mechanical hand was about to grab the Doctor by the neck when he finally came up with a plan. "I'd like to make a complaint." The KERBLAM man froze, its eyes partially reverting from red back to blue, leaving them a rather nice shade of purple. Why was it that a robot's eyes always turned red when they got mad? A question for another time. "I said I'd like to make a complaint." The KERBLAM man twitched before standing up straight and regaining its posture.
Of course, KERBLAM is dedicated to complete customer satisfaction. We will take all complaints very seriously.
Oh, yes, well, good.
Please state the nature of your complaint.
Right, the Doctor stuttered. He hadn't actually thought of a complaint yet. He subconsciously took a step back, increasing the distance between himself and the smiling robot. The back of his foot hit something. Risking a glance, the Doctor saw that it was the box containing the podcast mic. He snatched it up. "The mic I ordered, it was meant to be red, but this is..." He glanced down into the box. "Black. This one is black."
I am so sorry, sir. Let me check your order.
The Doctor was beginning to feel as though this would buy him less time than he had hoped.
You are mistaken, sir. You ordered a black podcast mic, but I would be happy to discuss exchanging it for you.
And with that, the KERBLAM man once again lunged at the Doctor, and at the same moment, the TARDIS finally gave him an answer. A stream of text danced across the monitor. It was a computer virus, one forcing the machine to want to kill him. Everything all of a sudden clicked into place. This time, the Doctor didn't jump out of the way. He let the KERBLAM man's cold metal hand squeeze around his neck. It was the only way to be close enough to the robot so he could do what he was about to do. With one hand, he pulled the Cyberman's device out of his pocket. With another, he ripped open the KERBLAM man's shirt, revealing various memory sticks and charger ports. "I really hope this works," the Doctor thought to himself as he plunged the device into the KERBLAM man. The robot immediately stopped moving, which unfortunately meant its hands were still clamped around the Doctor's neck. But as its eyes turned back from red to blue, its grip slackened until the Doctor was free to take a step back. As the Doctor caught his breath, he watched the KERBLAM man slowly begin to move again. It walked towards him, and the Doctor was concerned that his plan hadn't worked. But instead, the robot pulled the device out of its chest and handed it to the Doctor.
Excuse me, sir. I believe this belongs to you.
The Doctor took the device as the KERBLAM man then picked up the podcast mic in its box.
It seems we have delivered this item to you twice. I shall have to return this one. You won't be charged for the second item, but I'm afraid we cannot refund you the delivery charge.
And with that, the KERBLAM man teleported away. The Doctor stood there, staring at where the robot had been standing just a second before. Delivery charge? He thought to himself. Delivery charge? But I hacked the system for KERBLAM Prime, you stupid bucket of bolts. What an annoying development, he thought, before he remembered the Cyberman's device that he now held in his hand. A device that now contained a computer virus that would, in his past, attempt to take over the TARDIS and possess another robotic body in an attempt to kill him, that he would eventually trap on a cassette tape and throw into the Decalogue Diamond, the light of which was still shining through the open doors of the TARDIS. He knew what he had to do now. Engrave "Hello Sweetie" onto the side of the device, buy a bluey backpack and leave it in an alleyway in 1963. A good old-fashioned bootstrap paradox. It was still early days for this incarnation, but he could already tell that he really hated bootstrap paradoxes.
It all began with curiosity in a junkyard, a vast expanse of space littered with the carcasses of spaceships long since raided for anything of value. How could the Doctor resist exploring such a place? Whatever battle had happened here must have been awesome. Ships hadn't only been blasted with laser cannons and missiles, but in some cases quite literally ripped apart by hand. Many of the ships had grappler guns, specialised mechanical appendages originally designed for the construction jobs in space, but had quickly found new uses as weapons. Same old universe, the Doctor sighed as he walked along one of the grappler arms towards the giant gun still clenched within its mechanical fingers. Even the Doctor, a man known for his dislike of guns, couldn't help but whistle at the impressive size of the weapon he was now standing on. This is how big Godzilla's handgun would be. Wait, that doesn't make sense, he thought to himself. Godzilla doesn't need a gun, he has atomic breath. Maybe Jet Jaguar's gun? That would make more sense, he thought. Maybe it was time to dust off his Godzilla DVDs. It's been a while after all. The promise of a future movie night in his head, the Doctor went about exploring, walking up the gun barrel. It did look like he'd have a good view from the end of it. As he approached the muzzle, he began to hear something. A scuttering, shifting noise, scratchy too. Despite the modifications he'd made to his spaceship's helmet, it was proving quite tricky to ascertain exactly where the noise was coming from. Then again, he was in space. And as a famous movie tagline once said, in space, no one can hear you scream. Or hear you do anything for that matter, as sound doesn't travel through a vacuum. So they left one place the sounds could be coming from: the gun itself. Happy with his small bit of a deduction, the Doctor headed for the end of the gun's barrel, stepping smoothly across the 270-degree angle so he was standing on the muzzle. He grinned to himself, impressed with his own spacewalking, as he stepped up and looked down the gun barrel. Something was moving inside. Lots of somethings, scuttering around the inside of the gun. It looked like they were pulling it apart from the inside. Scavengers, most likely. He must have been wrong when he presumed they'd all long gone. The Doctor still couldn't make out who or what they were. He was about to reach into his pocket and pull out his old sunglasses, the ones that, rather ironically, allowed him to see better in the dark. This would have been a great idea if he hadn't been wearing his spacesuit. If he'd been able to reach his pocket through that, he'd be in a very big trouble indeed. He instead reached back, up to the small control panel he'd installed on the side of his helmet. He must have given it a feature to help in this situation. He pressed a few buttons and everything went dark. That had clearly been the wrong combination of buttons. This was the tricking Vashn Narada setting. He pressed a couple more buttons to turn the setting off. Suddenly, he was looking directly into a pair of bright orange eyes. A second ticked by before the creature let out a massive scream. The doctor jumped backwards and finally got a full view of the creature's scorpion-like anatomy. It was a SKITHRA, a scorpion-like race, and one of the most accomplished scavenger races in the universe. One the doctor had crossed on more than one occasion. As this was the first time the doctor had encountered them with this face, he'd hoped they wouldn't recognise him. This was a fleeting hope, as within a minute he was racing back along the grappler arm. He risked a glance over his shoulder, finding at least a dozen SKITHRA chasing after him, with one of their more humanoid queens bringing up the rear. He couldn't outrun them forever. He needed to come up with a very clever plan very quickly. He was good at plans, even in dire situations. An idea began to form in his mind, each piece falling into place like a jigsaw. That was until he was reminded of one of the SKITHRA's more unique abilities. When one fired an energy bolt from their tail, missing the doctor by only a couple of inches, the jigsaw, the idea, fell apart, but the pieces formed a new plan, one that might just work. The energy the SKITHRA could develop within their own bodies was a form of electricity, so if he could get them to fire the right spot on the grappler arm, it should in theory power it up. It wouldn't fully power it up, but just enough to give the SKITHRA a nasty surprise. He was clearing the end of the arm when he finally spotted what he was looking for, a missing panel, exposing a cobweb of wires behind. Many of his pursuers had begun firing their energy bolts at him, and some had almost got him, so it didn't take long for his plan to come to fruition. He stood above the exposed section of wires and waited for one of the SKITHRA to aim to fire at him. At the last second, the doctor jumped. As he floated away from the grappler arm, the bolt collided with the wires. A sudden burst of electricity caused the gigantic robot arm to jerk violently. Many of the SKITHRA were thrown off, floating away into space. The few that managed to keep a grip onto the grappler arm set about rescuing their comrades. Meanwhile, the doctor allowed himself to float off until he was close enough to another dead spaceship, at which point he activated a powerful electromagnetic with his spacesuit glove and floated towards it. He landed safely on the hull and made his way to the TARDIS. Without a small army chasing him, it was actually rather a pleasant journey. He found the TARDIS where he'd left her, within the long-abandoned control room of a Sontaran war wheel. "Hello, old girl," he said as he opened the door. Suddenly a few items, some papers, and various knickknacks floated out of the TARDIS door and past the doctor. "Oh no, is the gravity on the blink again?" he called into the ship. Grabbing what knickknacks he could, the doctor headed back to the TARDIS, locking the door behind him. If sound could travel through the vacuum of space, then the SKITHRA would have heard the wheezing, groaning sound of the ship taking off. But of course, sound doesn't travel through space. Though one of the pieces of paper that had floated out of the Time Lord ship did make the journey all the way to the SKITHRA Queen. She'd watched in dismay as the last of her people were pulled back down into the metal arm. They were safe from floating into space, which she was grateful for, but she was also annoyed that they had let the doctor escape. That's when the piece of paper floated up to her. Plucking it out of the air, she began to read it. A smile grew on her face as she realised this was a KERBLAM order form for a new podcast mic. She looked over at one of her underlings.
"Bring me the damaged KERBLAM man we've been keeping in storage," she said
with a smile.
"I think he can help us fulfill the doctor's order."
The doctor's feet hit the floor of the TARDIS control room. Finally, it looked that the gravity was working again. Finally, he could take a rest. Unfortunately, his relaxation only lasted about 5 seconds before the cloister bell rang out. He turned his attention to the scanner, only to see another police box flying towards him. It was his TARDIS, a future version according to the scanner. "Ah, biscuits," the doctor exclaimed as he jumped around the console. "I'm not doing this, not again. That's what I promised myself when Cricket Sandshoes rip a hole in space and time us like a Belgium." He didn't have much time. All he could do was divert his trajectory, just enough to avoid a temporal collision. long enough to avoid hitting the other TARDIS entirely. Checking the scanners again, he saw he'd knocked the other TARDIS off course. It was now heading to Earth, 1963. Well, that was a problem for his future self, wasn't it?